Hello everybody, thank you for joining me. I'm Tanya Weekly and I represent Peddlers Den, the home of the Makin collection. We are known as scenic stampers, and indeed that is what we focus on primarily, but our line, our projects, our classes span just about all of the different genre and techniques. Now this is our Secrets to Successful Scenic Stamping class. This is something that I've taught for many, many years at my retreats and at events, and this is going to be my first attempt at using our new website portal to offer some of these classes online. Now, if you want to order the booklet for Secrets to Successful Scenic Stamping, you can do that. This is a booklet that covers a lot of material, and it's a great reference pamphlet or booklet for anybody to keep. So that's on our website, and you can order this separately. When I teach, the most commonly asked question is, how do I know what to stamp first? Now, in real life, a big percentage of this class is lecture, and I understand that that doesn't really translate that well into video. So I'm going to be using some examples to illustrate my lecture, but some of this is basically still just going to be lecture. So what I tell people is your masking allows you to tuck one object behind another. And we're going to be looking at that a little bit. This is a really simple scene that we've done at some of our events as a Makin take. But as small as it is and as simple as it is very instructional. So here you've got basically three main images. You've got your cows, your silo, and your barn. Well, the first thing you would do is you would stamp your cows, and then you would place your mask, and we'll talk about how to cut a mask later, but you would place your mask over your cows so that you could then stamp the barn and tuck it behind the cows. Then if you wanted to stamp the silo, you leave your mask on your cows so that you can tuck that silo behind the cows. But if you also want to tuck the silo behind the barn, you would leave your mask on your cows, you would add a mask to the barn, and then you would stamp your silo so that your two masks would enable it to be tucked both behind the cows and behind the barn. So I think if you're new to scenic stamping and you're new to masking, I'm hoping that helping you understand that the mask allows you to tuck will help you understand what to stamp first. Generally speaking, you want to work from the front to the back, because generally speaking, you know, your foreground is going to have things tucked behind it. There are always exceptions to the rules. You only have to mask if you're actually overlapping images. If you're not overlapping images, the mask becomes irrelevant. Now, here is another pretty simple scene. In this one, the first thing we did was we stamped the snowbank, okay? Now, some of you are thinking, well, why didn't you stamp the deer first? Well, that's one of the beauties of using solid stamps. If you're using a silhouette or a bold image that you can't see through, you can always add those later. So in this case, we stamped the snow first, and then we put a mask on the snowbank to enable us to tuck the barn behind. Now, I wanted to add some trees and some snow here, so then I had to mask the barn to allow the tree to be tucked behind it, to allow these trees to be tucked behind it, and to allow some additional snow to be tucked behind it. As I mentioned earlier, the deers can be put in later because they are a silhouette. The birds can be put in at any time, partly because they're a silhouette and partly because they don't overlap anything. Now, the holly and the berries is an open image, but because it doesn't overlap any other image, those can be put in at any time as well. One of the situations that is likely to trip people up, and I don't have an example of one handy to show you, is if you were doing, let's say, a open image. Let's pretend that these deer were just a line image and you could see through them. Then we would have to stamp them first, mask them, before we did the snow here. And the reason for that is we would be tucking that snow underneath their feet. So even though we've got foreground here, we're still tucking that underneath of the feet of the deer. So that's one of the things that kind of trips people up. It will help you if you think of your scene in layers. Now, the other thing that we want to accomplish in lesson 1 of this course is we want to share some tips on perspective. Objects that are close to you are going to appear larger. So, all right, let's go back to this one. You know that these trees are actually taller and bigger than these deer. We know that. But because the deer are close to us, they're in the foreground, they have to be larger and these trees have to be smaller to give you the perspective. By making these trees small and indistinct, it pushes them into the distance. This tree, of course, is near you, so it's very large. These trees are meant to be far, far away, so they're small. The deer need to be proportionately larger than what the trees would be in real life here, but since they're beside the barn, they need to be smaller than the barn. If you look closely, you can see that they are taller than the barn door. But what that does is that brings the deer right up close to you, pushes the barn into the distance, and then it pushes these trees even farther into the distance. So objects that appear to you, objects that are close to you, are always going to appear larger. They're also going to be more distinct. So we're going to look at this. This again is a real simple make and take that we've done at some of our shows, and it's not even finished. But I want you to consider what this looks like. And I mean, it's nice. You know, we've got the moon, we've got a lighter blue around the moon because that would be the glow of the moon. It's kind of glowing down towards the wolf. Then we've added the deeper blue. But if you really want to dress it out, adding some gray trees. Now all of a sudden it looks like we have a forest that goes far, far away. Hopefully you can see this good. So by adding some less distinct trees, now it creates depth. Now you've got distance. Here it looks very flat. Also, by increasing the values, so we've gone from a much lighter value here to a little darker, darker yet, and the darkest. By doing that, it creates depth. Our eyes are drawn to light. So if you want to draw the viewer into your scene, you want to be sure that you have some light wherever you want them to be drawn to. So if you just compare these two, I think you will agree that this scene, because of all the various values, actually pulls you into the scene, whereas this one looks very flat. This one is unfinished. So if you're doing something like this and you get to a point like this, the scene is not flawed, it's just unfinished. You need to increase your values. You need to do something to create some depth. Now we're going to talk a little bit about creating the distance that we just detailed using values. I'm going to take a Post-it note here and use it as a very crude mask. I'm gonna put it on my paper here, and I am going to use one of our mostly solid pine trees, and we are going to create a snowy ridge of trees. Now you can stamp your trees in green, you can stamp them in black, you can stamp them whatever. But what we're going to do is we are going to ink up our stamp. And today I am using our newest green, our jungle green. And we are going to do a large tree. And of course, when you stamp, you should press firmly. Give the ink time to migrate from the stamp to the paper, but don't rock. Okay, so there is a tree. Now you can stamp a second time. You can do a second generation stamp, and a lot of people do when they're using this technique. But I want to show you, if I just stamp this without re-inking, I get a pile of ink here, and this is where the stamp crossed over the mask. Okay, so you're always going to get that pile of ink, and we don't want that pile of ink. So if you want to do a second generation stamp, you always have to make sure that that pile of ink is actually on your mask, not on your card. Or you can go back and you can just re-ink. Now, things in nature tend to be in uneven numbers. Now this tree, I'm stamping a little bit shorter, so it's going to look smaller. And let's see, let's do some up here. I'm kind of making this up as I go. Here's one. Now, the ones that are smaller, the ones that are shorter like this, these are going to look like they're farther away. Let's see, do I want any more? Yeah, I think that's good on that color. Now I'm going to go to our lighter green, our fern green, and I'm going to ink the stamp up. And I'm going to put one right about here. Okay. Now let's see if we can do one here. And now I'm going to try a second generation stamp without re-inking, but you see that I'm moving it down so that that pile of ink is on my mask, not on my card. And if you want the paler one, you can always stamp off on your I call it practice paper. And then you can come back and you can do one here. Like I said, I'm making it up as I go. And I think I'm going to come back with another dark one here. I'll put a little dark one there. All right. Now we're going to remove this. And what you have is the illusion of a snowy ridge of trees. And it was just that easy. We used 2 colors of ink. We used 1 stamp. By stamping taller or shorter off of the mask, we've developed trees that look like they're all different sizes. You could easily put like a big Merry Christmas or whatever right here, and this could be a completed card. If you wanted to jazz it up a little more, maybe you'd want to put some deer, some birds, or whatever. But something just as fast and simple as this gives you some perspective, partly because we've started tall and we've gotten smaller, and partly because we've used varying shades of the color or various values. So far we've learned that things that are closer to you appear large, and things that are closer to you appear darker and more distinct. If it's farther away, it tends to be lighter and less distinct. And of course, in nature, things are random, and a lot of my students chuckle because I'm always telling them that random is hard. As human beings, we tend to want to create patterns, and that's not the way things grow in nature. So sometimes being random is hard. And they also are generally more appealing and look more realistic if you work with odd numbers instead of even numbers. If I was going to do a scene that I wanted to look realistic, I always add life. Now, going back to this scene, it would have been suitable without the deer and without the birds. Maybe instead of the deer or the birds, you would have added a larger, different greeting. But what I teach is that if you want your scene to look alive, you have to add life. And life can be an animal, it can be a bird, it can actually be energy as well. So in a night scene, instead of life, you could use lightning, because that is electric, that is energy, that is movement, and that will bring that same kind of energy or life to your scene. If you are doing a tropical scene, you maybe would do a volcano exploding, and you would again have the same kind of energy or the same kind of life. Now liken this to something like this. And this is an example of using some of our images where you don't do any masking. This is what I call a traditional rendition, where you stamp and you color and you're done. You don't have to mask, you don't have to do a lot of planning. But I want you to compare the two of these, and I want you to see the difference between how this one tends to look alive, because it has life in it, and this one is still very nice, but it doesn't have the same vibrancy. next thing we're going to talk a little bit about is values and contrasts. Now, many, many years ago, going all the way back to the early 1980s, I taught drawing. And the first thing that I taught my students was about values. We started out, well, it was a drawing class, so we started out working just with black and white. And the first day of the first class, they took out their drawing pad, they took out their set of drawing pencils. I had them make 10 boxes on their paper, and I told them that the first box was white. They weren't going to do anything to it. That was the color of the paper showing through. Then I told them to go over to the 10th box, and using one of their soft pencils, I wanted them to make the blackest black possible in that box, which they did. That was simple enough. Then I gave them the task of creating 8 shades between the solid white and the solid black. And they had to use whichever drawing pencils they wanted to, but they had to create something that looked very much like this. It had 10 boxes, and it had 10 different shades of black. This is called a value chart. And if you want your artwork to appear dimensional, if you want your artwork to appear like it is coming off of the paper as opposed to being flat, you need to have a range of values. You need to have contrast, and you absolutely need to have some of your darkest darks and your whitest whites. This is easy to look at in black and white, but the same fundamental applies to color. It just becomes much, much, much more complicated because some colors the eye sees as dark, and other colors the eye sees as light, and they're not always obvious. Today we're not going into that. But as we moved on, and as the students would begin doing drawings that were complete frameable compositions, it was very common for them to bring me their artwork and show it to me, and it was actually pretty common for them to ask me if it was okay, if it was finished. And most of the time I would say, this is a really good start, but you need to finish it. And many times they were very, very surprised. But what they weren't seeing is that they didn't have contrast. They didn't have a range of values. And because of that, their artwork looked very flat. Now, there are some artists' tricks that I normally share with my stampers. And you know, we're going to just look at this real quickly. Now, I already told you that your eye is drawn to light. So you're being kind of pulled in here because we have some light values going on. We've done the framing. We've added the dark around the edges. But this looks pretty dimensional because we have a wide range of values. If you're not certain whether your artwork is finished or not, and I don't have any unfinished right here beside me, but what I always encourage my stamping students to do is the same thing I used to encourage my drawing students to do. And I would say, okay, so take your drawing and turn it upside down. And take a few steps away from your table and look at your artwork, 1, from a distance, and 2, upside down. And you will generally very quickly see where your good areas are, where you're getting your contrast and your dimension, and where the areas are that are unfinished and flat. What you're doing when you do this is by flipping your artwork upside down, your eye tends to stop seeing each individual component and it begins to see it as a whole. By stepping back a few steps or looking at it from a distance, however far that is, you have given your eye and your brain separation. And if you're really having trouble, if you've worked on the piece too long, you may want to actually go have lunch and come back, or let it sit overnight and come back. But if you look at it upside down from a distance, you will very quickly be able to see which areas appear flat and which areas appear dimensional. Now, like I said, I don't have any examples right here to really illustrate this, but we're going to look at this one. We have some light values here. The viewer is being drawn in. We've added dark around the edges. That's framing it, which helps to draw the viewer in. But if you look here at the snowbank, we didn't leave it just white. We've added different gradations, and that tends to help it pop out. It helps to make it look more dimensional. I don't know if you can see it or not, but we've actually, after we got done, we actually went back with some white gel pen to enhance the highlights. And many times we'll do this. Many times when we're finished, or nearly finished, with a piece of artwork, we will go back in and we will, I call it, reinsert the highlights that we've lost. So right here, you know, we had lost some of these highlights, and we can go back and we can reinsert them. Now, I sometimes have trouble with my camera refocusing when I pull the artwork up close, but hopefully you can see where we've reinserted some highlights here. We've even reinserted some highlights along the edges of the bare branches. And, you know, so we've got our dark darks, we got our light lights, and we've got a wide range of values in between. So that concludes lesson 1 of our Secrets to Successful Scenic Stamping. Hopefully after this brief tutorial, hopefully you have a better understanding of what to stamp first, how to plan your scenes in terms of what to stamp first, and hopefully you have some very basic fundamentals of very, very basic composition. So thank you for joining me. Again, I have the booklet that all of my students get when they take this class in person. And we are going to have this on our website for sale. You can take this class without having the booklet. You can make your own notes. But most people actually really enjoy having the booklet, and they refer to it many times for years. So again, thank you for joining me, and hopefully I'll see you again in lesson 2.